In the last video, we really focused on the global view of the cardiovascular system and the ability to move blood both to the lungs to oxygenate that blood and then to the body to deliver oxygen, remove CO2, and deliver nutrients such as glucose and fatty acids. What we're going to do now in this next module is we're going to take a deeper look into the pump of that system, which is, of course, cardiac muscle. So time for terrible pun. We will get to the heart of the matter in this video. That's right, terrible, I know. So the objectives is we're going to dig deep into the structure of heart, and then you need to be able to compare kind of what cardiac muscle cells look like and how they function as compared to skeletal muscle. So first, let's start with the myocardium. So just like skeletal muscle, the heart wall is composed of 3 layers. You'll see that even on the prefixes of the muscle that they're the same. So we have the epi and the endo, with the myo being in the middle. So epi, just like in skeletal muscle, is that outer layer of connective tissue that surrounds the heart. It's immediately outside and is largely made up, again, of connective tissue to serve as a protective layer for skeletal muscle. We then have the middle of the heart, which is the myocardium, as you can see here. The myocardium is the contracting muscle of the heart, right? It is what is going to be doing all the contractions, made up of cardiomyocytes. And then the last layer is the endocardium. This is the innermost layer that lines the chamber heart. Unlike the epicardium, which is connective tissue, the endocardium is really made up of things that are similar to the cells that line blood vessels. These cells are specifically called endothelial cells, and they provide a protection and a barrier from the myocardium and the blood inside the heart. So to kind of review that, we have connective tissue here, we have cardiac muscle or cardiomyocytes here, and then we have endothelial cells here on the endocardium to make up the 3 major layers of skeletal muscle. Since, of course, it is a contracting muscle, it's going to need lots of substrates and oxygen for utilization. It is delivered that by specific arteries that are called coronary arteries, which branch directly off the aorta and circle the heart. We'll take a little bit more look into this in the next figure. Last but not least, we have, again, the veins, which is going to take blood back to back into the venous system and then dump into the right side of the heart because it's deoxygenated, and it will then be pumped in the pulmonary system. So if we take a look at the blood supply of the heart, while I think this is some really great and important stuff, I don't want to get too much into the anatomy of things. I just want you to kind of see this and visualize how the heart is and how these vessels supply. So as we move through and talk about exercise, know that the heart demands a lot of blood flow. Right? As you can imagine, we know likely from experience that your heart rate beats faster and faster as you exercise. The faster it contracts, the more contractions it's doing, the more blood flow and blood supply it's going to need. And so as you can see, it has a very, very well-developed blood supply of both arteries and veins that feed every part of the heart in order to supply these. Right? Again, these are all coronary arteries. They come straight off the aorta to supply fully oxygenated blood. They then cover both the right and left sides, and they are importantly all on the outer surface. So you can see that really well here in this picture. This isn't some type of spliced view or drawing. These arteries and veins actually lay on the outside of the heart muscle so that they're not compressed during contraction, which is interesting. So one of the problems is if you have a heart attack, what happens during a heart attack is essentially flow in these arteries get blocked off by some type of plaque. And so you can imagine, depending on where that is, that anytime we cut blood flow off, we have the potential to have death of the muscle there. So let's look at then what what are some of the similarities and differences for skeletal muscle and heart muscle? So in general, we can say that both of them are striated muscles. They contain our two primary skeletal muscle contractile proteins, which are our actin or our thin filaments, and our myosin, which is our thick filaments. They use calcium the same way, so calcium is there when calcium comes in and binds from the SR. It will activate myofilaments and cause contraction. It is believed that the sliding filament theory applies, so as you visualize how the heart is contracting, that we can kind of squeeze these striations or sarcomeres together. And just like in the length-tension relationship in skeletal muscle, heart follows that as well. So the idea is the length tension. And this will come into play much later in the chapter, but we'll get into how the heart can actually alter the amount of blood that it pumps, right, based on this link tension. So it follows that. So the overlap of actin and myosin are ultimately going to determine how much, how strong the contraction is from the heart. So what are some of the differences? So they actually look pretty different, actually. So cardiac muscle is shorter and connected in a tight series, right? So our skeletal muscles, if you remember when I talked about the structure of muscle, that they can be these really long, thin tubes that some of them can run the entire length of an entire muscle. So they're huge, long cells. Cardiac muscles are much, much shorter, as you can see here, and as you can see in our muscle, we just have these kind of like tubes laid next to each other, whereas these cardiac fibers are connected and really jam-packed together, right? In skeletal muscle, we have these very straight tubes, whereas cardiac muscle fibers are branched, right? So you can see here, this is a good picture, a good illustration here of these kind of like branching. So they're a little bit more of an irregular shape. One of the other things is that heart muscles are connected by intercalated discs. What that means is these two muscle fibers have a connection with each other, a protein that allows this signals being sent from this heart muscle cell can then talk to this muscle cell. Whereas in our skeletal muscle, these are mostly independent, right? And we'll see that calcium can actually flow through these as we talk about how in this next point where we talk about them. So intercalated discs are essentially leaky membranes that allow ions to cross from one fiber to another, permitting the transmission of electrical impulses. Right? When we talked about skeletal muscle, we mentioned that essentially the contraction was determined by a motor unit. So a motor unit would come in and it would maybe branch, and we'll say it was on these two fibers, right? So, or we can go on these three fibers here. So if an action potential was sent down the nerve, these three muscle fibers would contract. Since these two muscle fibers are not part of that motor unit, they wouldn't do anything. They would stay relaxed in the relaxed state. However, because cardiac muscles, don't have motor unit innervation, right? We don't have conscious control over the heart, then they actually communicate with each other. So as one cardiac muscle cell contracts, it will actually spread that contraction to the next cardiomyocyte sitting right next to it through these intercalated discs. Right? So, and the idea is that when one fiber is depolarized to cause a muscle contraction, then this, all the fibers then next to it contract as well based on these intercalated discs. And it has a special name. It's called a functional syncytium. And again, just this idea that as one contracts, all of the fibers around it will contract at the same time. So a couple other compare and contrast, the idea that human heart fibers don't have different fiber types, right? So we don't have a type 1 or a type 2 or a type 2A. We just have one type, cardiomyocytes or heart muscle cells, and that's it. If we had to put it into a category similar to skeletal muscle, it would be much more similar to a type 1 fiber than a type 2 fiber. And of course, this makes sense, right? Our heart continues to contract, works all the time. Therefore, we can imagine that the type of metabolism that is going to rely on is going to be very aerobic, right, in order to maintain constant contractions at all points in time. So they are highly aerobic, contain huge numbers of mitochondria. And when I say larger, I mean 2 to 3 times more mitochondria than a type 1 muscle fiber. So if we had to group them closer to a type 1, but even more oxidative, even more fatigue resistant, and lots of mitochondria. So that finishes up how skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle are different. We talked briefly about the idea of being able to spread contractions from one cell to another, and that's ultimately what we're going to talk about in the next video, where we talk about the cardiac cycle.